Gary, welcome to my high-quality Covent Garden TV studio.
This is a lovely place you've got here, Gordon. It's fantastic.
Yeah. Airbnb did well. You know, it's funny. I read an article years ago, I think when I was still in London, about the Airbnb aesthetic is kind of, it's its own form of McDonald's. So that kind of millennial sleeve to this kind of look
IKEA
kind of,
maybe a little bit upgraded from IKEA, sort of.
Yeah.
It's very nice and angular and clean.
But there's a language to it that is it's a performance of uniqueness, but because it's a performed uniqueness, it's the same everywhere. So you kind of have like a wacky rug. Exactly. So we're in one of them. We're in one of them in London. We aren't self-quarantined yet, although with the camera sitting in front of it, it does look like that. Day 27.
Well, let's hope not.
It's well, we want to talk about Jung, which is definitely worth pursuing, but in a funny way, I guess, starting with the virus narrative or cloud, the viral cloud, is a good place to start, because a similar thing I think happens with eco-alarmism, where you can make the case that people's emotional investment in, and in particular fear, is a unhealthy form of re-enchantment. Because you would just tell us a story. You're outside and people are on this lovely day proclaiming the end of the world.
Yeah. Well, jokingly, I mean, I was at the queue at a market in my neighborhood, which the shelves weren't empty. They were a couple days earlier, but they've been restocked. But there were a lot of people in the queue. A lot of people had their baskets, topped up as much as they could. And this one guy was saying, kind of joking, I didn't catch the whole conversation, but it was like, "Oh, it's the end of the world," and everyone kind of giggled a little and snickered a little around him. And you think, God, I mean, we've been waiting for that for quite some time. I mean, the kind of build up to something like this. I mean, I think it's been. I mean, Jung would say it was kind of archetype of some kind, and I understand what you mean. It's kind of a negative transformation in a way. But I think Jung is very important for our time. Just in the overall sense that the whole idea that if you don't, make an arrangement or a dialogue with the unconscious, whatever you want to call it, the psyche, it'll work out its own needs and purposes in other ways as well. You go along for the ride, or you're kind of taken. Yeah. And this kind of corona mania, you might want to say. While obviously there are, objective, real reasons to be concerned, at the same time it's turned into this kind of craze where people are acting in very neurotic, strange ways.
And it's nested or interlocked neuroses or complexes. Let's be a little bit more Jungian about it, because it's to do with a whole bunch of stuff. There's unexamined death fears for a start, but also it speaks to intimacy and human contact and all that kind of thing, that, as you say, if you haven't done the work of looking or of turning a friendly face to the unconscious, when an event like this happens, you get captured by all kinds of crazy stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's sort of an invitation to, Jung would say, or Jungian would say, to project. You project these fears on, and the idea that it's some virus that's invisible too, so you can't really see it. You can't really tell if someone's got it or not unless you have the gear to be able to test them. So anybody who looks a little bit like they're sweating or something suddenly becomes, oh, by the way, Gordon, are you okay? You feeling all right?
I'm all right.
I mean, I made the mistake a few nights ago of watching the George Romero film, The Crazies, which I hadn't seen in ages. I think I saw it when it came out in '73. And it was very, very strange, because the whole scenario is where there's a breakout of a sort of biological kind of weapon, and then the army's sent in to contain it, but they're all wearing protective gear, so they all look anonymous. They're all in the white gear with the masks and everything, and the people don't know what's happening, and so they want to defend themselves against these invaders, and it all just collapses into chaos. And
do they hold toilet paper in that film?
I don't know. That's a funny thing. I don't think they had the chance to go, because it was a very quick acting virus.
Right.
So, but I mean, that's the other thing too. I mean, one has to say, without getting too graphic or crude here, but the idea the crisis brings out the priorities in people. I mean, apparently toothpaste is something else that people were stocking up on. So
it's when the toilet paper thing, as far as I could, As far as I can tell, I think my people started that because I think Australia panicked for toilet paper first, like a week and a half or so ago,
Right.
which is surprising for a couple of reasons. And the only thing I can think of is that maybe during the like the Suez crisis or one of the energy crises in the 70s, we must have some older Australian must have a memory of us running out of toilet paper. This is what happens when you have a supply chain disruption, because there was in the news, like Australia manufactures this toilet paper domestically. That was in the news, like, this isn't going to run out.
Right.
Everyone relax.
Well,
this doesn't come from China.
I mean, poor Australia. I mean, you had the fires, obviously, and now it's like the toilet paper. And it made me think of another film, The Last Wave. What's his name? When we did Gallipoli.
Oh, right. Yes, I know what you mean.
Hanging a picnic.
Picnic and Hanging Rock.
Not hanging a picnic rock, but any case, yeah, it's just this apocalypse. Peter Weir.
Peter Weir, that's it.
And this apocalyptic vision, happening.
Australia has that. Speaking of Jung, Australia's always been like a thing that people can project. Particularly, we studied this at school, particularly like the white apocalypse and post-apocalypse. Melbourne being one of the world cities that survives the nuclear conflagration and so on. So there's this psychological, like the literally white post-apocalypse was how we were learning about it. Kind of. But Australia's a weird place for that kind of stuff. This is why people should talk about things like Jung.
Yeah. Oh, I think absolutely. Again, it's. Why? I mean, again, well, we don't know. I mean, you open the can of worms, and it's sort of like, okay, we only know what we see on TV or on our Twitter feeds or something. So everyone's got some conspiracy theory going now, narrative about the virus. So I mean, I'm assuming there is at least a strata of actual truth about something going on that's starting this, and then everything else gets kind of dumped on top of it.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It's cosmic Rorschach. But like one of the things I wanted to have a discussion about with you while I was in London, because it pertains to a number of the other events that are going on, is essentially Jung as a person. So I want to talk about Jung as a person. A couple of things that I don't think people, I think, will bring some of his ideas and his writings to life if we come at him from that angle. And then some of those writings, a selection of them, and then, because I haven't really done this before, and Jung comes up often on the show, kind of hit a few of the key ideas that he contributed, not just to what became the mental health world, but just generally speaking to culture. So the first question, was he a good person?
Well, it depends what you mean by good, I guess. He had his faults and his foibles.
A lot of affairs, Gary.
Yeah, this is something. Well, I mean, I just was reading about that because I've been rereading a lot of Jung because I'm about to start a book about synchronicity and precognitive dreams. And I was reading about how he and like his contemporary H.G. Wells, and they actually knew each other and met. Although Wells was a bit more callous about this, where they had mistresses. I mean, Wells, he went so far as to put portraits of them up on the mantelpiece, and his poor wife had to put up with that. But Emma Jung had to put up with Jung one long-term relationship with Tony Wolff, and then there's the whole thing that got it started with Sabina Spielrein and a variety of others. But he was a very impressive, powerful, dominant figure, and a lot of women, came to him and were attracted by him, and they all flocked around him. There was an old joke about the Jungfrau that was supposed to be, all the women that were surrounding Jung and all that. So, I mean, yeah, it depends on how strict a moral view you take of this, how much you want to take him to task. I do think, though, that, some of the therapeutic behavior he got up to would be frowned upon today. I mean, I think it was exaggerated in that film, The Dangerous Method and all that. But, I mean, but the thing about that, I mean, just to mention the guy who got Jung going in that department, because he actually was quite straight-laced and conservative, but Otto Gross was this radical Freudian, and his father was a famous criminologist, Hans Gross, and he brought Otto to Freud because Otto was addicted to cocaine and morphine and was into free love and lots of other wild things at that time. And Freud didn't take him on, but he sent him down to Jung in Zurich at the Begozli clinic. And while Jung was treating Sabine Spielrein, he was also supposed to be analyzing Otto Gross, but Gross turned it around and he started analyzing Jung and telling Jung that, you should be less conservative, you should cut loose, you have to,
that would have been a
throw off. He has a brief kind of appearance in what's his name's film. No, actually, I thought of writing a book about him, but I have to get around to it. But in any case, no, Jung, I think, yeah, he allowed himself, and he even said in correspondence with Freud that, the basis of a good marriage is allowing a certain infidelity.
But do you think Emma got the same? Because that's the thing. In the 21st century, how people run their relationships.
Did she have affairs?
Yeah.
I think there's some speculation that she may have. Yeah,
I hope so.
She certainly confided a lot in Freud about this. They had a correspondence about this.
Yeah,
and there's times when she had enough and she was leaving him, and then what would happen is Jung would collapse. He would become absolutely helpless, and
I remember that in your book, and that's what I'm like. I don't think you're. And that's why I wanted to ask the good question. Like, was he a good person question? Because
I think he was a good person. I think he had his faults, like most people do. And because he was a great person in the sense of a genius and all that, the faults loom larger than all of us. Put it this way: there's a lot of unfaithful husbands who didn't write works of genius. That's a good point. So, but not to condone it, but to say,
Yeah. So for people who are unaware, Emma came from money. So quite a bit of it. So because of that. Jung ended up making his own money, but there was he had the runway that he needed to become Jung.
Absolutely, yeah.
And there's just something a bit manipulative, as you say. She tried to leave him several times, and he would sort of revert back to the illness as excuse thing that he had as a kid, and collapse and get seriously ill so that she couldn't leave. That's a dick move.
Well, what can you say? It was true about him, but you could assess him on that alone, let's say, or more heavily on that than other things, and come up to the conclusion that he wasn't a good person. But I think in general, he seemed very generous. He apparently was very, very friendly and congenial. He was kind of large character, larger than life sort of character. And Emma stayed. She had the children. I guess she also got some amount of satisfaction at being, Mrs. Jung. Toni Wolff wasn't Mrs. Jung. She was around, but I don't want to defend him on this point.
Oh yeah,
but I could say, but if you're going to start racking up, the number of geniuses who were real sons of bitches, I think he might rank mid-range, but Wagner was worse.
Yeah, the point's well made, right? That there are plenty of other husbands who might marry for money, which I don't think he did, but he ended up getting it.
Well, the story is that he saw her first when he was 21 and she was 14, and he said, I'm going to marry this woman. And it wasn't until however many years later that he started to, actually court her, and she turned him down at first and all that. And I'm sure she had many other suitors. So, I don't, she wasn't sitting on the shelf, I don't think, waiting for anybody to pick her up. So, she must have seen something in Jung.
Yeah, good. All right. So, potentially an easier question. Was he a good writer?
That's I think, easier question to answer. He's not the most clearest, excuse me, see, I'm bad there, most clearest. He's not the most clear writer of his ideas. He is served well by people like Marie-Louise von Franz, and the other who I find very good at making Jung's ideas clear is Anthony Storr, who's a Jungian analyst. He died some years ago. No, he's, in a way, he's sort of like Heidegger, though I think he is more readable than Heidegger.
Yes, sure.
That because he's obscure, he creates an industry around him, trying to explain him and all that sort of things. But the funny thing is he can be. When he does his introductions to things, if you know his introduction or whatever it is, his preface or something, or forward to The Secret of the Golden Flower, this is one of the most important things he wrote, and it's one of the most clear things. Keep doing that. Most clear thing he wrote about two very, very important of his ideas: active imagination and the transcendent function. Although he doesn't name them in this piece itself, but he's talking about them in the context of Chinese alchemy, and it's very readable. Let's see, his introduction to the I Ching, things that sort. And
some of the lectures, yeah,
his lectures are very clear too. I think when he starts to write something, he kind of puts on his, academic hat, and I'm Herr Dr. Professor, and it has to be this, and it comes out in this very turgid, often very turgid German professorial kind of prose that he's not a page turner. I mean, he can things like Answer to Job, and again some of the later writing, maybe The Undiscovered Self. It's a bit, because I think these are more written for popular kind of audiences rather than psychological papers and that. So no, he's. I mean, Arthur Koestler said he's a sad example of a great mind tying itself up in knots. Especially when he's trying to talk about synchronicity and things of that sort.
So that, because the name of your book, and we were just talking about where the title came from before we hit the record button, right? The question of was he a mystic is couched in a whole thing that happened to him, and to some extent Freud as well, where they did have to, they had to kind of like, if they want to invent an entire industry, they have to kind of science up their nonsense, right? So there's always this tension, as you say, it's the Herr Doctor Professor thing. When he's sitting down to write his books for essentially a medical audience, he has to sound as sciencey and fancy pants as possible, and it's. In many respects, it's a pity, but it's the other side of was he a mystic, because he would disavow that in a we'll get to that in just a moment. But because of that, it's the same thing, right? Like, was he a mystic is also the reason, perhaps, why some of the writing has the, as you call it, the Herr Doctor Professor effect.
Well, I think he feels like he needs to do that. It's also, well, I think at times he doesn't quite know exactly what he's trying to say, and it sort of goes round. I mean, he sort of has an idea, and he even says it's sort of this circumambulation, so it's not this direct. I mean, Marie-Louise Lanfrance is more masculine in that sense, because it's very direct. She's very straightforward, direct. I mean, a lot of her books are actually made up of lectures, but they're very, very, concise and clear. And she gets to the point where Jung, it's sort of like this. I mean, I think one of the problems with Jung is he'll start out giving you examples and allusions as his method of amplification, linking things up to different mythological things. And then on page 2 of that, you've forgotten what the initial trigger was to get this chain of associations going. And I'm kind of, okay, but, and so I think he gets carried away like that. I mean, his first big book, Symbols of Transformation, is like that. But also in that book, this is where he makes his break with Freud, and he kind of hid that. He hid the ingredient that was certainly going to make it clear that he and Freud were going different ways. That's towards the end of the book, and this is a lot before then. You have to kind of get through to get to that. And no, I think like the archetypes. Let's say, I mean, he talks about them as inherited characteristics, sort of Lamarckian, inheritance of acquired characteristics. Then there's somehow configurations actually in the brain itself in some way, some organic kind of harbor for them. And then they're also like the Platonic forms. And saying this, I'm not saying the archetypes aren't an important idea, they are, but it's when he tries to nail it down exactly what it is. Although, I mean, in recent times, or last 20 years or so, there's been a lot of work in Jungian archetypes and evolutionary biology. Anthony Stevens was a Jungian psychologist who bridged that gap, and he's actually said there's more scientific evidence for something like the archetypes today than there was in Jung's own time. So,
I mean, you have to, it's a century ago now that the stuff was being written about, so science does advance. And it's essentially a discussion around pattern. He has a Crowley problem, which is because he lived for so long and wrote so much, it depends what decade you can get him on that he'll actually... It might be a different thing.
Yeah, sure. No, it's true. Sure. I mean, it was only towards the end of his life that he was asked to write something for a popular audience, and that's his contribution to Man and His Symbols. But when you were saying earlier, who owns Jung? Is it the psychological, or the psychiatric, or the scientific, or the New Agers? But I think certainly he was never really picked up by the mainstream intellectual world. I mean, if they liked anybody, it was Freud, but by the late 50s into 60s, just after he died, he was certainly picked up by the grassroots, people, who were interested in his ideas. I mean, that's the thing. And he even said that himself, that he felt that the common people were more interested in his ideas, and he talked about how people would come to his house at Kusnak and thank him for writing all these wonderful books. I don't quite understand exactly what they mean, but I know they're important, and they've meant a lot to me in my life and things like that. So I think he felt, he always wanted to be accepted. I mean, the other thing he went on about that he was an artist.
Yeah, true.
Which gives it away if you know the Red Book.
Yeah.
If you know his stone carvings. I mean, he even built a castle. Bollingen and all that.
And people don't realize that he actually learned how to get the stone, ship the stone out of the quarry.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, he was a very physical character like that too. He was sort of
military man.
He was a man's man in that sense. Very earthy. He was a very, very good cook, apparently, too. But no, he went on and on. I mean, this is the whole depending on your point of view, either his descent into the unconscious or his psychotic breakdown after the breakup with Freud, when he was plunging into the collective unconscious, or as he less often calls it, the objective psyche, which I think is a better term. Maybe we can go on to that in a bit. But he encountered these beings, these people living inside his head, and one of them was this woman's voice that he later said that this was his encounter with the anima. She was telling, he asked her, like, what is it I am doing? And this is when he was producing all these paintings and this wonderful calligraphy in the Red Book, of these visions he was having. And she said, it's art. And he, no, it's not art. And because he wants to be discovering these things, not inventing them, not creating them. He wants to be discovering them somehow. So, but I mean, as we all know, I mean, even Jung himself would say, art. Yes, our dreams are part of this collective, or they can be, but they're also very, very personal. They're about, they speak in a symbolic language, but about you. It's not necessarily a symbol that you can apply in all cases. It's a symbol that is in the context of your own life. So even though Jung had these huge dreams, the big dreams, as they call them, they're also very much about him as well. And so I think there's, in some way, inherent, there's a difficulty there trying to separate. I guess this is the whole scientific kind of problem. You want to separate yourself from your discovery so that it's real and objective and not just something that's relative to me. And this is, when you're an artist, it doesn't care. Yes, it comes out of you, but it has application to the larger world. But its source isn't necessarily in doubt. But I think this is a problem Jung, had and struggled with, throughout his life.
So disavowing mystic and disavowing artist is the same thing, because do you forgive him for that? Like, I get why. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I think he was very canny. I think he was. Yeah. I think he had, he had a good career sense in that sense. And I don't mean to dismiss him by this, but he was very strategic and tactical, and he played his cards close to his chest. I mean, the story is that he was experimenting with the I Ching as early as 1919, 1920, but he doesn't come out of the closet about it until, I don't know, 1949, is it? 1950, when that edition of Richard Wilhelm's translation comes out, and he writes the intro to it. So he's experimenting with the thing for 30 years, and he mentions it here and there, but it's not something that he comes forth with. And the same thing like with the astrology. I mean, he was doing, casting horoscopes for his clients, and also, for the Western civilization in general. That his late book Aeon is about that, and he's talking about the age of Aquarius in 1940, and so all this stuff was happening, but he kept it very close to his chest.
We were joking about it before. He was a one-man 60s in the 30s. There are like stories of people encountering him in his tower where he's like dressed like essentially an exotic oriental alchemist, and he's doing the I Ching and like essentially a back to the land movement, because he built his own tower. I Ching, astrology. He was doing the 60s, 30s early.
And all of that. So again, and also living, as you say, back to the land. I mean, he lived in this tower in Bollingen. He didn't have any electricity. He had to pump his own water, chop his own wood, and all this. There was no heating. I think towards the end, Louise von Franz convinced him to put some sort of heating in, because he was getting old and sort of needed it. But I mean, also, even a bit earlier, because Jung was in this milieu in the early 20th century, the 19 teens, where in Switzerland, there was Ascona, and there was Monte Verita, Mountain of Truth, and this is where kind of the counterculture began, as one book has it, and people like Hermann Hesse were there, and Isadora Duncan. It was all back to nature, nudism, you know, health craze, health food sort of thing. This fellow Otto Gross was there, I mentioned earlier, with free love and cocaine and morphine, and Theodore Royce, who was sort of the head of the OTO, who later got involved with Crowley, he was there, and all this kind of stuff. So this was, and then in Munich, Germany, the Schwabing district was another place. And if you ever read Richard Knoll's scandalous book, The Jung Cult, which he's wrong about practically everything, but it's a very good read, because it's about this milieu in Monte Verita and in Schwabing at this time, just leading up to sort of World War I, where you have all this, it's like the beginning of the Vogue kind of sensibility and the back to nature sort of thing, and all that stuff comes around again. You know, I mean, nothing is new as what's been done before, and it's cyclical because you can only go in so many sort of directions. You know, you sort of, I mean, there's, I'm very keen on this distinction that, or this remark that the historian Arnold Toynbee made last century, where he said when a culture is faced in its time of troubles and crisis, it has two sort of stereotypical ways to react to it. It tries to recapture the past in some way, is what he calls the archaist movement. It goes back to the past, or it's the futures to the future. And so you sort of have that, you know, going on. Now you have the whole transhuman, you know, a-human, whatever it is. You know, we're extinct now. You know, everybody, oh, finally, pooh, I'm glad that's over with. That lets us off the hook. Or, you know, let's get back to off the grid, back to nature. We have to get rid of everything like that. And yeah, I would say, you know, and Toynbee was someone who knew of Jung, and they knew each other's work and all that. So yeah, I would say we're sort of going through something like that now, and I think you can see evidence of the kind of reaction.
Yes, definitely,
you know?
Definitely. So, all right, I think from a person perspective, because kind of coming back to, was he a good person? And just to hang it on the affairs, I mean, is like the bit I want to get to is he wasn't that great a father.
Well, now you took the words out of my mind. I was thinking that because I mean I was going to say, like, his son tells the story of when Jung was going through his turbulent time, descent into the unconscious, and he thought he was going mad. He kept a loaded pistol under his pillow, ready to blow his brains out if things got too bad. And his son said, "Do you know what it's like to grow up with a father who kept a loaded pistol under the pillow?" You know, if he had a bad dream, he was going to blow his brains out. And there's the whole, as far as I understood it, his immediate, his sons, they were, I forget his name, I think the eldest son, he was very dismissive, apparently, about something like the Red Book. People would come and say, oh, this silly thing that my father put away or something, he would take it out and show it and not be, you know, particularly... I think, you know, you asked, like, who owned Jung or who owns him. I think that his family at one point, at least I could tell from what I've read, they felt that he had been taken from them by the culture at large. He was no longer just, you know, their father. He had become this world guru, as it were, this, you know, famous figure. You know, he's on Time magazine, he's being interviewed on television, all this kind of stuff, and people were coming to the house all the time to see him, and, you know, he no longer belonged to them, and I think they resented that that sort of invasion of their privacy, as it were. You know? I
think, and it is taking, especially if it happens young, it's taking your father away, right? Because I think about that with like the Tolkiens, right? I think the same thing. I think the recently passed Christopher Tolkien. I think a lot of his what's perceived, and he did an amazing sonly job of putting all that kind of stuff that was never meant for publication into an order and made it available for the world, right? But he's always very precise and dismissive of when Tolkien's influence would get out of the canon and do stuff. And I think it's that same thing. I think if your father becomes, and at the same time too, in the 60s, if your father becomes a thing that is important and critically important to counterculture, then there's a psychological impact. Like the world took my dad, basically.
Oh, well, there's a story. I mean, I don't know how true it is, but at one point point, Jung, I mean, he wasn't around very much. This when his children were young, and then they finally got together on some Sunday outing and went boating or something like that. And he asks one of the children, "Who are you?" He says, "Oh, I'm your daughter," whatever her name was. So he's like, "Oh, I forgot." So I mean, I don't know how true that is, but that story's told. So I mean, yeah, I mean, I mean, you can find lots of foibles with him and problems with him in that, but I think. What can you say? I mean, for the world at large, he seemed a very congenial. I don't know if you must have seen that interview with him.
Yes.
And you know, he's laughing, you know, all the time, and there's a kind of, you know, not quite Santa Claus, but a kind of, you know, very vital, you know, very warm kind of sense coming out. So, but you know, people's private lives, they always become difficult and problematic.
So, why I wanted to frame it around the open question of who owns him is that there was a key event in publishing history is, of course, whatever it is now, 15 or so years ago, that the Red Book was in fact published, which he didn't really want in his lifetime, and neither did the family, and it took decades to come out. And we've done a couple of shows about that before, and it is a remarkable document, but it's kind of like a BC AD moment for Jung, right? Yeah. Because it shifts. He went to all that effort, and more importantly, and I don't mean this in too much of a negative way, but the lesser minds who came after him and built sort of Jungian analysis into what it is, have that need to kind of play dress-up scientists, and all of a sudden you have this record of madness that's also like objective proof of a spirit world.
Exactly.
And so, like, when it's the question of who owns him, and I don't think it's a final thing as much as I don't think in the maybe middle of the 20th century you could kind of, or even towards the end, say that you would look to official groups of Jungian analysts to say this is canonical Jungian and this isn't. And I don't think that happens anymore. I think because of something like the Red Book, and that's why I wanted to have this show to kind of discuss what I think his key concepts are, not even in a therapeutic sense, but ideas. We'll start with collective unconscious, obviously. No, I'll do a better one, because what I want to do is I think he belongs to the world. Sorry, kids, but I think he belongs to the world now, and it's sort of dismissive to say, oh, he got taken up by the New Age. Like, that's not good enough, because
well, if you're going to do that, there's lots of stuff you got to chuck out there.
Yeah, but like it's
New Age took up lots of stuff that you know, was very good in itself, and if it gets tarred with that brush, well, you know, we're going to have to lose a great deal of your library, I think. So
exactly, but it's also been influential on films and anthropology and biology. So like,
absolutely,
and in that sense, I think we should let's start with this one, because you kind of hinted at it before. What are the archetypes, and is it even one of, this is controversial, is it even one of his more important ideas?
Well, as I mentioned briefly earlier, that Jung, not as often as I feel would have been better, he uses this term objective psyche rather than collective unconscious. Because I guess, for one, because collective, it sort of means like it's like this all one kind of thing, or like we all have kind of pipes, you know, hooked up to our heads. It's a big kind of, you know, vast reservoir of something like that. And I don't think that's quite what he really meant. Objective psyche, I think, says it better, because he's saying fundamentally there's parts of our interior world that have nothing to do with us. All right, it's not about us. It's not about you personally in that sense. I mean, if you I mean, when Swedenborg was taken by the angels to heaven and hell and other planets, I would say he was in the objective psyche too. And when Henri Corbin talks about the kind of interior journeys that the Persian Gnostic philosopher Suhrawardi went on, you know, these two were sort of journeys into this objective psyche. And Aldous Huxley, in I think it's Heaven and Hell, he talks about the mind has its own antipodes, its own, well, at the time he was writing in the 50s, its own dark Africas and Amazonian basins. And so, meaning there's on the surface there's us in some way, whatever you're thinking about, your memories and, you know, whatever, all that kind of stuff. And then occasionally we go in deeper, whatever metaphor you want to use, or higher, and you enter something where what's happening in your mind is not necessarily just about you in particular. So it could be a parapsychological event, it could be a precognitive one, it could be a dream that's one of the big dreams or something like that. But this is something, and I think the archetypes have the same problem that the Platonic forms have. Like, where do you stop?
Yeah.
How many, is there an archetype for everything? You know what I'm saying? This was one of the things where I felt, because I mean, Jung was one of the first people I read. I read Memories, Dreams, and Reflection when I was about 14 or 15. I stole a copy from my high school library. I posted it back to them many years later.
Oh, that's good.
But I didn't leave a note or anything, so they didn't know. Yeah. But I mean, I got onto him from reading Hermann Hesse, and you know, I was part of the Hesse craze in the early 70s. You know, millions of kids in the States and the UK were reading all those books, and Jung was always kind of associated with him. And so over the years, I've read a lot of, actually, written a book about it and all that, but I never was quite comfortable with the notion of the archetypes, because it was sort of like, it seemed too kind of packaged. Like, there's this one and that kind of thing. And the overall general idea that we don't come into the world tabula rasa, that I associate. I mean, I understand that, and I think that's true. We come equipped with whatever you want to call it, some kind of you know, formative design or something that reaches out into the world and gives it shape and things of that sort. So I mean, but in a broad sense, you can associate that sort of with phenomenology and intentionality and things of that sort, or even the Kantian categories. So I mean, there's all differences between all those things. Obviously, we could spend a lot of time, you know, fine-tuning it. But in general, rather than, well, as I say in my books, you know, the standard idea of the human psyche is sort of like it's an empty flat. And then you have to go to IKEA, buy a lot of stuff, you come home, you bring it in, and then it's furnished. So the senses are IKEA. You know, we you know, gradually take in stuff from the senses, and we furnish our inner world. And Jung and Plato and Goethe and Husserl and so many others are saying, actually, no, there's something in there in the first place, otherwise you wouldn't have a world. Yeah. You need something to be able to give it shape and form and all that. So on that level, I think it's an important idea. And also the notion that in our deep interior, we enter a realm that is not about us personally. And that's where Jung met these characters, you know, Salome and Philemon and Khan, and he spoke with them. I mean, he did go mad. He was doing things that people came to him about. Doctor, I'm talking to people in my head. Well, that's when did this start? Well, he was doing that himself, but he was doing it on purpose. You know, I guess he's kind of, you know, he's the wounded healer in that sense. You know, he the only way he could really understand madness and the problems that people will be facing is for him to go through it himself and map it out. You know, so
I like the idea that it's probably a bit over described. So archetypes are, and I think that's a problem with Jung again, because he's trying to science things up, right? Yeah. But it's also a function of the time. So if you look at something like the anima animus idea, it hasn't aged that well in the context of how we understand gender, for instance. But it's 110 years old, and if you look at it in that sense, even more. And well, no, that's about fair. But if you actually look at what a radical idea it was to say that a man has a woman in him, like, fine, it's gender binary, which is not how we think with gender anymore, but it's actually a pretty impressive idea. And I think the archetypes are kind of, so that's an example of it being over described. And I know people, because that's a criticism, as well as the race stuff, which we'll get to in a minute, I guess, that's a criticism people throw at him, like the animus idea is somehow terrible. And I'm like, no, it's just it's just from a different time. If you look at, if Jung was doing this today, let me tell you, his understanding of, say, the trans experience would be actually quite interesting, I think.
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, well, the thing is also, you know, you have whatever the contemporary concerns are will come up. They'll be the thing most people are talking about, and so something like the anima idea, I can see where it can be. And it's not only just now, I guess, sort of in the 70s with the rise of feminism and all that, it was something that became, and the whole idea that, well, you know, women are like this and all that, and so on. But still, if you can put aside those particular kind of definitions and ways of looking at it, and just learn, sort of experience that autonomy of what he calls the unconscious, whatever you want to call it. I think that's the main kind of thing, you know.
Yeah.
However you want to map it out, you know. I mean, as I said, I've been writing my dreams down. I mean, recently for this sort of almost a year and a half now, but over the years I've been writing them down for forever. And I can't say that I ever started thinking about what archetype was this, what things like that. But it's sort of the story. I mean, the story that the dream sort of tells, and it speaks into symbolic language, and occasionally the symbols can be something that's bigger, you know, like larger, transcendent sort of thing. And I can see where he talks about the transcendent function, where there's some symbols in a dream can, you know, they combine opposites and they allow you to rise up above what seems to be a problem that's insoluble. You know, so you don't solve the problem, you rise up above it, and it's not a problem anymore. So I can see that process taking place, but it's not like the sort of archetype hunting kind of thing. Yeah. I mean, again, some people might find that useful. Myself, I've never particularly found that useful. So I just felt like you kind of put that aside. I mean, I think you can do that with all these thinkers, whether it's Jung or Gurdjieff or Steiner or Crowley. You don't have to accept everything. And Jung would be the first one to say is what's important is what works. Yeah. And he said, I don't have a dream theory. I have no theory about dreams. I see what the dream is about. I see what it's trying to say, and some basic ideas, but there's no particular kind of theory in the sense, even like Freud's ideas or something like that. So it's like what works is what's important. So if the archetypes don't work for you, that's obviously that's fine. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. So that's good. So do we need to? I think you're right about collective unconscious is a deceptive word for a very useful idea, potentially deceptive word for a very useful idea. Where objective psyche, because I remember this from first encountering Gnosticism 5 million years ago. His definition of gnosis was essentially getting a true understanding of the psyche, which is to say we're in it, not it's in us.
Exactly.
So if you talk like objective psyche, I like your redescription, because again he uses collective unconscious and archetypes in different ways to mean different things, and the actual profundity of this concept can get lost or fumbled in that situation, can't it?
Well, I said it's a kind of industry. I remember this is some time ago when I was living in Los Angeles, and I was working at a bookshop that was a big metaphysical bookshop, and then there were endless books coming out about the trickster or the hag or the wise old man, and there's a lot of interesting things in it, but it was sort of like, it was collect all 25 kind of thing, which I felt a little like, I felt it was sort of missing, the main point, which I say for me was sort of the experience of the autonomy of these parts of ourselves, whatever we want to call it, the unconscious or the psyche or something. I think that's the important thing, and I think that's what Jung realized was important too, developing a kind of real vital dialogue with it. And once that starts going, I mean, I'm not trying to sell Jung, but once you start experiencing that, you realize, he was onto something.
He was definitely
onto something here. It might not be the best expositor of his own ideas, but he certainly was onto something.
Yeah. All right. So for other important concepts, let's try it differently for the remaining ones, because that's one of them, and then we'll come back to almost trying to rank them. I know it's a game rather than anything else, right? So other Jungian, I guess, insights or contributions that we should both define, but then rank in terms of importance. So we've got active imagination. We've done archetypes. Transcendent function, individuation, the shadow, and synchronicity. So,
sounds good.
Have I missed anything off that list in terms of important contributions?
It depends. The introvert and extrovert and all that. I mean, but a lot of just like Freudian slip. This is something a lot of people might don't even know exactly what it means, but if it happens in life, they'll, or like introvert and extroverts is kind of common knowledge. And I think that's probably a complex, and introvert, extrovert are probably the Jungian terms that have had the widest, spread in the.
Do you reckon more than synchronicity?
Well, I think. Well, I mean, in the New Age alternative world, yes, but somebody could say, "Oh, you've got a mother complex," and they might not have ever heard of synchronicity.
Yeah.
And they probably don't even know what the complex complex means. It just means that whenever your mother comes up, you get angry or something like that. So, and this was the stuff he did early on. The complex is what he did. And the complex, this is from his word association test, and this is the hard statistical experimental science that he had his roots in. So that's another difference between him and Freud. Freud's clientele were a particular, strata of Viennese society, and Jung was working in a mental asylum. Yeah. For a good 10 years, more or less, and engaging with real,
there was some
serious schizophrenic,
some really
psychotic characters
from your book. Yeah. There's some really, really interesting. People were a special kind of mad. Like, they thought they lived on the moon.
Oh, yeah.
It's amazing. Like, that's really, really mentally unwell.
Well, that's that's the thing. And it's he sort of had wider kind of clinical experience than Freud. I mean, Freud was, and the private clients of a particular kind, that sort of thing. So, but I would say, complex introvert, extrovert. The people like to go to the parties, and there's people like to stay home. That's sort of about it. But no, active imagination. I think this is one of his most important ideas, and it's a kind of Jungian practice. It's something you can do. You can write down your dreams, which is the other sort of main practice. But dreaming sort of happens to you. I think Jung would have been a bit critical of the whole idea that we can kind of manufacture our dreams, a sort of lucid dream industry, or so, which again, I'm not against it in any way, but Jung would say dreams are a natural expression of the psyche. So it's a natural sort of manifestation of our other self, other part of us, and to kind of start trying to guide that process is the ego getting in to where the self is and kind of manipulating and not not sort of hearing what that because the main Jungian idea, although he said he didn't have the theory, but the main Jungian idea of dreams is the compensatory. So if you have a very very specific attitude in your conscious life, it may be too one-sided, and your dream will, and it doesn't have to be bad, and good. It could be, you may be ignoring good things about yourself, and your dream can tell you them. I mean, we tend to think it's the other way around. But active imagination is basically it's a way of dreaming while you're awake, and it's very much related to something that we all experience twice a day, hypnagogia, which is this in-between sleeping and waking state. And Jung was a very good hypnagogist. If you read Memory, Dreams, and Reflections, he talks about that, this sort of in-between state, seeing visions. It's a way of sort of getting into that state consciously, on purpose. It's kind of meditative. But instead of shooing away the fantasies that would come up, as one would do in kind of meditation, because you don't want to focus on that. You actually engage, you pick one of them, and you engage with it in some way. And as Jung did in his Descent into the Unconscious, the aim is to see if you could have a dialogue with this fantasy, because the fantasy too is a kind of spontaneous expression of the psyche, of the objective psyche, let's say. And you can have a conscious, waking dialogue exchange with it. And there's some people, Jung, that's what he was doing in the Red Book. And he has these fantastic adventures and stuff like that. There's no guarantee you're going to have the same kind of roller coaster ride, but that's the idea. But
some stick figures.
But some people have accounts, and there's different Jungian analysts that have published accounts of different clients who have engaged in this.
Bit of a camera error there, but we were, I think before the camera rudely interrupted us by getting too hot, you were going to talk about transcendent function.
Transcendent function. I think this is the other very important idea of Jung's, and it's related to active imagination. And transcendent function is fundamentally the unconscious ability to come up with the symbol that is able to reconcile what seem to be irreconcilable opposites. And if you find yourself in some insoluble situation where you can't choose between one or the other, both, there's no way out, both options seem bad choices, and if you can endure that sort of tension, a dream may produce a kind of symbol that brings the two things together in some way, and creates a third. tertium non datum, or I guess, the Hegelian kind of, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. It's very similar, although Jung is saying it's on a psychological level. And it's transcendent in the sense that, not in transcendental meditation or some cosmic sort of way, but in the sense that it raises the consciousness up above the problem. So you don't necessarily find a solution to the problem, but what had caused you panic and grave concern and was driving you crazy, suddenly you see it from a different perspective. You rise up above it. And this is one of the things that he spells out in this introduction to The Secret of the Golden Flower. And he talks about one of his clients experiencing this. And it's whole idea about somehow it has a sort of image of, it's as if you're on a mountaintop and you can see a storm below you. So the storm is still going on, but you're not in it, and you're up above it. And essentially it's about broadening your perspective. Some problem that had you gripped like this and you couldn't get out of, suddenly your consciousness is opened up to wider perspectives. More meaningful sorts of horizons open up. And you can see something that... it could be something as simple as suddenly becoming interested in something, and you're fascinated with it, and you realize, oh, what was I so worried about? And that doesn't seem such a big problem anymore, because the energy that had been sort of bottled up in that conflict has been released by the symbol in the dream, and it flows into consciousness. And so this is the sort of thing that Jung would say that he would be trying to lead his clients toward, to somehow endure the conflict long enough for the tension to produce this kind of reconciling symbol.
It's one of the things that I think is profound in its implications, because what he's saying is that there's a part of the human that is not its thoughts, that in that sense it is cosmic, like it's literally transcended. There's a thing in you. So first of all, the objective, thoughts predate you, and so the world of the mind is at least in some large part not you. So there's an objective mindscape or spiritscape, and also there's a part of the human that is not its thoughts that can do this. So it's actually like, it is quite profound.
Well, no, it's terrifically profound. And you said it earlier. It's like we think of the mind or the psyche as something in us, but we are in it.
Yes,
and that would be one of the turnarounds that should come about as you become more acquainted with the autonomy and the intelligence of the psyche, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I'm not trying to sell this, but I know from my own experience from recording dreams and a variety of different things that whatever it is, it's very intelligent, and it's clever, and it could be very funny. It all could be very, very frank and straightforward, and give you the message, clear as day. Sometimes it's so clear that you miss it because you're looking for something deeper and more esoteric, when it's just, fundamentally, get your act together or something like that. And this is this other part of us that's not us. It's in the sense that it's not your verbal left brain ego that identifies with language. The ego, we identify with being able to speak, and that other side of us doesn't use language, but it uses symbols or pictures or metaphors or plays on words or jokes and things of that sort. It's almost like a rebus kind of something, and if you learn how to read, there's a word and then there's an image of something, and then something else, and you put those things together. And this was for me the kind of turning point was when I was looking at dreams and all that, and I suddenly realized, oh God, now I see what that means. It's like, it's saying something, it's very important, but it's sometimes very, very simple. And it's said in words. It's said not in words, it's said in images and symbols and pictures. It's a pictorial kind of language. And then whatever it is, it's intelligent. And I feel bad saying it, because it's more of a who than an it. I mean, this is, again, we tend to think of it this way because we're trying to be scientists and look at it objectively and all that, but actually as you more and more engage, you realize it is part of yourself. I mean, maybe it's the right brain, or maybe it's not the right brain, but it is some other part of ourselves that is not the verbal I. And again, we are actually in it more than it's not like, oh, it's over there. It's kind of like we're like, we kind of pop out of it.
Exactly.
Our sense of being an independent I, we kind of pop out of it. And you can associate this with the Gnostic kind of whole myth of the demiurge who thinks it's the god, sees the world it's created, I must be, and it has no idea that it's actually part of or subordinate to some higher, larger intelligence. And this is something Ian McGilchrist, has been talking about, the master and his emissary, in terms of the left and right brain, where you can read the same kind of conflict or tension between those two, or situation in terms of the Gnostic kind of myth as well, and Jung's relation between the ego and the self. I mean, I guess where Freud would say where id was, there will be ego. I guess for Jung we would say where the ego is, there will be self. It sort of moves, and there's a difference there too, because Freud's id is some nasty, bestial, dark, horrible kind of thing that we all want to keep in the closet, and Jung's self is this fount of creative energy and vitality and vision and all that. So he had a much more positive, optimistic view of the unconscious than Freud did.
Yeah. Cool. So next one, I think this is there's some minor ones, but the next big one we want to hit to stack them. So do you think it is synchronicity, right? So, okay, let's say what that is, and then we'll try to rank whether collective unconscious, transcended function, synchronicity, and active imagination are like in what
they're all
order.
sort of parts of the same thing too.
That was the bit.
Kind of like pseudopodia coming out. We see them appearing through different cracks, but actually behind all that, there's...
You're spoiling the end of the show.
Oh, sorry. But no, synchronicity, meaningful coincidence. That's the simplest way to I would say. When something going on in here and something in the outer world connects, not in any causal kind of way, one making the other happen, but through a meaningful... I had one just recently. I was on my way to give a talk at the Theosophical Society here on Colin Wilson. And naturally, if you know Colin Wilson's work, the book everybody knows is The Outsider. And I did... it was a two-part talk, and the first part was about his early work, The Outsider, and he wrote all these books called The Outsider Cycle that nobody knows about but are really important, and so on. And on my way to the Theosophical Society, I stopped at my local market to pick up something, and I was in the queue, and there was the magazine rack at the checkout stand, and I look over, and there's it's a kind of stack like that, and in between two other magazines, there was the March issue of Vogue. And everything else was blocked on the cover except for the title, The Outsider.
Yeah, very good.
And I later looked up, it was about a pop singer, Billie Eilish or something. I don't know, I haven't the slightest idea. So I didn't even peek over and see what it was about. I just looked over and I said, okay, right. Yeah. I'm on my way to talk about The Outsider, and there you go. So there's a little tap on the shoulder saying, you're on the right path, or things are going okay. So things like that happen often. And
can I give you one that just happened to me an hour ago? So I was in Treadwell's, where I'm speaking tomorrow, and I look in the Pacific section, and there's a book that's spine out, so it's not front facing, and it says, Gordon, the embarrassing Australian.
They knew you were coming.
But it's an old book, it's an old second-hand book, and it...
had you known of this book before?
Yeah, it's about actually well, famous is the wrong word, but an historic Australian Aborigine who was in the military. But it just says Gordon, the embarrassing Australian, there in Treadwell's. So obviously it's going to go great tomorrow. So
that's fantastic! Wow,
meaningful coincidence, right? It's another one that's profound in its implications, because it's almost like if we're embedded in the psyche. So is everything else. So actually that's how synchronicity works, right? Which is essentially that there is an interiority to all things. So a thought that appears in my mind can also appear in a thing in what we perceive to be the external. That's why when we say meaningful coincidences, Jung has this incredible hermetic cosmology, right? And there are just these ideas that are almost or terms that are icebergs. So we say, and they all kind of come down onto this thing, which is where in the mind and ideas, essentially where in the mind ideas are spirits, this stuff is all real and the universe is alive.
He has this notion of the psychoid, which is, you could say it's some sort of liminal state between matter and psyche. I mean, he coins the term, so I mean that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the case, but it's he wants to. But I think again, Jung he's not the best person to go to try to understand synchronicity.
Good point.
Because in the book that he wrote about it, and he shared the book with Wolfgang Pauli, who had his own sort of thing about it as well. He really only gives one clear example of synchronicity, because it becomes a kind of umbrella term that he uses for all paranormal events. So he tries to understand precognition and whatever, clairvoyance and a variety of other sorts of things in terms of synchronicity, and it becomes a kind of deus ex machina almost that he pulls out all the time. And again, he's trying to be super scientific in this as well, and you can understand, because he's talking about basically how these things that most rational people would just rack up to coincidence, so isn't that strange, but well, statistically you might think that might happen, blah blah blah, it isn't that strange. He's saying no, there is some other, a causal connecting principle, which Arthur Koestler pointed out is a meaningless phrase. It means a cause that isn't a cause. But in a sense, he said it's things that are connected by meaning, by not in any kind of cause and effect relationship. And it suggests to me is that we've thought this about the mind, I guess, since the rise of science, this Cartesian separation between mind and the world, but actually they participate in some way which we don't really understand. Yes. We've been told about this by quantum physics telling us that, like, well, there is no plate glass window between the observer and the observed. I just wrote a piece about this for the web journal, and this is Heisenberg's sort of thing. The very act of observing something, we interfere with it in some way. So we know that, but still in everyday life we kind of like, oh well, yeah, that's those elementary whatsits do that, but we know there's a clear separation between what's happening here and what's happening out there, but apparently there isn't. Most of the time there is, and it's good that there is. We the Bergson idea that the brain is a filter. It has an eliminatory function. It filters out stuff. Yeah. And there's lots of studies about people under psychedelics. They seem to have more synchronicities happening, or more kind of paranormal events happening. So in one sense, we're probably awash in this kind of stuff. But in order to get on with things, we have to filter it out. And every now and then, one pops through. Now, the strange thing is that it pops through in some way that's meaningful to you in particular. This is the really weird stuff. It's not just some, there's lots of examples of strange coincidences. The French gentleman in the plum pudding is one of the famous ones, where he always shows up and the other guy orders the plum pudding, and it's sort of like that happens so many times.
Coming back to the coronavirus.
All right, yeah.
Like 1983, Dean Koontz book about a virus from Wuhan.
Oh, well, there you go. So, I mean, or the wreck of the Titanic,
exactly.
and all that. Yeah. But then there's ones that are like micro, channeled to you in particular, and it's like, who knows that? Who knows that? How did that copy of Vogue get there? Why did I go in then? Yeah. And at that point...
To be at the part of the queue that saw the magazine...
And the strange thing was, I forgot something. I had to go later on in the day to get something. Went in the same queue, and they had changed the magazines.
Yeah.
So it wasn't there. So if I didn't go at that time, I would not have seen it at all.
Yeah,
so,
I like it.
And that's when you start to think, okay,
and then
somebody is up there.
When it is so much more intelligent than you, that's when you get like, how do you arrange? Because for that to have worked, you had to arrange the universe from the point of its creation to you.
It's very, very difficult. This is where the rational mind says, okay, do you think that some super consciousness is there, putting things together in such a way that you would be there at that time to see that magazine? I mean,
yes.
Well, do you have a better way to account for it? But, so I mean, and it's the mind boggles at that.
So the last one is, and I think in many respects this might be at the bottom of the list, and I'll ask this question in a different way. So let's give us a definition of individuation, and if you think it even exists.
Well, it goes back to what is it? The Greek poet Pindar. Become who you are.
Sure.
Nietzsche talks about that as well. Eke homo. Become who you are. We have potentia in us, and it's making it actual in some way. So I would guess, individuation. I mean, in Jungian terms, it's basically lining up your archetypes so you have a relationship with them, and you go through this sort of process, and it's usually the shadow is the first one you encounter. It's all this stuff about yourself that you don't recognize or don't want to admit, and that kind of thing, and you have to face that. And then he's mentioned the anima. You encounter the opposite contrasexual side of your psyche, whatever that might be. And those are sort of the first three ones, and this is on the way to encountering the self, which is the total psyche. The ego is a very, very brightly lit part of the psyche, and this is, its job is basically to give direction out in the world and to guide us through the world and consciousness. But it's become unaware of the rest of it that it's attached to, and the whole process of individuation is to become full. Total, you're a fragment. If you're just aware of ego consciousness, you're still a fragment. It's become total. And it's also, as mentioned about Jung being, advised to throw off bourgeois conventionality, it's also about finding your own way, becoming who you are. Not. This was when I was a kid, when I first was reading something. Yeah, that's what because I caught the tail end of the '60s. Do your own thing, and march to the beat of a different drum, all that kind of stuff. And Jung was sort of saying that. So what is that about? Who are you, and not part of the uniform masses, and you find your own way in the world and don't follow the dictates of society and all. I mean, becoming who you are can sadly be an excuse for license and just but I've read about that.
I choose to be a drunk.
I've read about that in the context of someone like Crowley, because become who you are, do what that will. They're not too far apart, and the whole idea of finding your true will would be the same kind of thing as individuating. But sadly, it can often be used as an excuse for But Jung is again. It's a shame that he wasn't clear about this, but in one of his early papers, when he is talking about individuation, I talk about it in the book, I forget the title of it now, but he does say that an individuator, it's not enough for them to throw off the constraints of bourgeois conventionality and society's norms. They have to be able to adopt and manifest an even higher law, an even more serious about it. Otherwise, they're good for nothing. They're just based. And again, Jung had a negative idea about artists, because the artists that he knew of at the time when he was developing ideas, they were the bohemians, and they weren't very industrious. They kind of they may paint, they might not paint, or they might not write a poem or something. And he was very industrious, efficient, workaholic. He got things done. So the whole idea of these artists had a negative kind of deadbeat character for him. So when he's talking about the individuators, it's not just society's misfits. It's not just people who can't get with the program or just decide to live by their own law. They take on an even more severe and austere kind of discipline, which is the law of their own being. So it's not what your conscious mind chooses. Exactly. That's the other thing. It's not like, ooh, I identify as this and I identify as that. It's not about that at all. It's about sort of taking on the challenge of kind of giving up the ego's autonomy and to be able to hear, a kind of rule in a certain way, a kind of direction and guide coming from something deeper within yourself. And again, you can't take someone's temperature to know whether that's actually happening or not. And it's a difficult thing to gauge and see what happens. So there is a thin line. There's a thin line between. It's this thing about the antinomian. Where you're beyond good and evil. You're beyond the norms. Well, you can be on the norms as a sinner, and you can be on the norms as a saint, and it's not too easy all the time to know which is which. It's just the caution that Jung gives about this. So he was aware of that problem, and Nietzsche was as well too.
Well, because we probably don't have time for it this time. His philosophical influences, but. So the thing about individuation for me, you mentioned Crowley as another example, or become who you are. I'm just wondering, it's almost like, because a lot of people, mystic spiritualist types throughout history, have said something like that. The weird thing about it, it's Gnostic, right? Like, some of the early Gnostic groups, some of the Gnostic groups would argue, as would early Christians, about whether you could be saved or not, whether it was foregone, right? Whether there was any point in using whatever Christian ritual gives you salvation, because God had decided if you were saved or not. Yeah. And there's something about individuation that reminds me of that, which is it either going to happen or not? Well,
Jung says it's a natural process. Yeah. And going through Jungian analysis of therapy, or doing active imagination, these things can speed it up. So it's much like alchemy. Alchemy speeds up natural processes. It's what nature's doing, but we're doing it a lot quicker. So that sort of thing. And well, the thing is, I don't think it's predestined, because he would say, like, the problem with modern man is that we're not individuated, and becoming who you are, again, as you said, it's not necessarily a conscious decision, and it's developing a real vital living dialogue with the unconscious, with the other parts of the psyche that we're not conscious of or engaged with, and so it's filling out your own inner world, and I don't think. I would say for Jung it wouldn't be predestined at all, because you said it requires a certain effort. You know, it happens naturally. See, but in the same way, like, well, you know, G.K. Chesterton, the English writer, said he always wondered why there were so many brilliant children, why were there so many dud adults. So when you're the children, is everyone, the potential is there, and by the time you sort of hit a certain age, you know, you've gone through the normal kind of stages of life. But you haven't carried that, you know, further. Life takes you a certain distance.
But so that would be predestined. Do you know what I mean? Some people get it and some people don't.
Well, I mean, I know, but not everybody's a great violinist, right? But we can appreciate what they do, and we can have deep experiences by, you know, listening to their music and all that. So,
just like, for me, how to say this? It's not that it is a perfectly valid description of of becoming who you are as a fulfillment of dreaming. So I think of it in Aboriginal concepts. The Aboriginal version of that would be to fulfill those dreamings which are seeking expression in you, right?
Yeah, sure, absolutely,
So this is what I mean. Like, was it an important contribution? Is individuation an important contribution to the world if we already kind of have that idea? Do you know? Can I put it at the bottom of the list? Am I just being mean to it?
Strangely enough, for me, it was always been an important idea for me, because I just like that idea. And he said it. Other people, Nietzsche talks about it. Schopenhauer talks about it. This whole idea of, Jung, in the bit from the Red Book days that he did give to some people to read, this thing called the Seven Sermons to the Dead. It is a Gnostic kind of track, and it's about distinguishing yourself from the pleroma. So there's the all, where everything is undifferentiated and indistinct. It's part of the all, and then the process of to individuate, to become yourself, to become a whole. You could say it's becoming the microcosm in the macrocosm. You know, I mean, we all are potential microcosms, because according to Hermetic ideas, we all in some way reflect the cosmos as a whole. We have that which is in the cosmos is also in us in some way, as above, so below, and so on. But we don't all, and no one is stopping anybody from doing it. It requires effort. I mean, and you know, I have no idea. You know, I mean, that's one of the first things people say. Well, do you think you're into it? I don't know. I like to think I'm working on it, but apparently it's a lifelong, you know, task, and I have no idea. But I don't. It's one of the things that seems like something worthwhile to you know, put my energy into. So, you know.
All right.
But I mean, what do you want to say? I mean, are you saying like, well, it's not democratic, or it sounds elite, or something like that?
I think I resonate with other descriptions of the same process.
Yeah, sure.
So I think that's what I mean. Whereas, for instance, synchronicity and even collective unconscious, as we've discussed it here, there are some terms or ideas, or Jung in his lifetime put some cosmic notions together in a way that are really fucking useful.
Well, there's you know, there are post-Jungians who took argument with individuation. James Hillman was one of them. But he was cozying up to Derrida and the deconstructionists. So the idea of, you know, things being whole was no, we're all supposed to be fragments now and bits and pieces, and there isn't the self that we're, you know, no, this you know, a whole, you know, variety or so. But you know, it's all. I was saying, you can find. Well, I think historically, the process of so many ideas and counter ideas and critiques and commentaries on those ideas and post something is just sped up in recent years. So it's in some ways you have to kind of push all that stuff away to get down to what Jung or any of these major thinkers are saying. You can buy the latest book on Nietzsche, and I don't know,
There'll be no Nietzsche.
I'm just going to tell you about Nietzsche. I'm going
Yeah.
to tell you about what the 25 guys before that guy said about Nietzsche. And again, Nietzsche's another one who talks about the same thing, become who you are, ecce homo, but also in his very early essays. I think it's Schopenhauer Educator. He talks about, if you want to know who you are, look to your heroes. Look to what have you loved. So he's not talking about it in a psyche kind of, Jungian way. He's saying, look at your life hitherto, like what has moved you, what has, been very important to you and all that, it's through engaging with that you will find out who you are. And again, Nietzsche's also, but Nietzsche, the self or you don't find yourself as if you misplaced it, you make a self over time. So there's a bit more of a creative aspect in Nietzsche's idea of become who you are. You're certain potential, but there's effort, choices, a creative engagement with the world that enables you to bring that about. So it's not so much find. I think this is one of the differences too. I think Jung too, it often sounds like, you find yourself, but it's not, it isn't finding it. You somehow work your way towards it. You kind of make it. It's a kind of co-create, co-discover, co-create kind of process at the same time, I would say.
Okay. All right, so let's rank them. Let's play this game.
Okay, all right.
So most important contribution is either collective unconscious / objective psyche, or synchronicity or active imagination. Let's put them on the podium.
Right.
So number one?
Well, in a certain sense, I think it depends. Important in what way? You mean culturally, at large, or what? As they say today, what is the takeaway from this from Jung? I mean, I would say the transcendent function, because all you have to do is pay attention to your dreams.
All right.
You don't have to buy any theory about them at all, except the idea that they do communicate in a pictorial language. You pay attention to your dreams, pay attention to what's going on in your life, and that way I think you could see the autonomy of this, and that would lead on to objective psyche, whatever you want to call it. I mean, Jung didn't give a name for it, but his approach to the unconscious, I would say, is probably the most important thing, because we kind of still have this notion of the unconscious, Freudian unconscious, it's some nasty kind of stuff with all that bad stuff in there, and it's like, well, no, actually, it's your friend and ally, who's just metaphorically a few micrometers away from one side of your head to the other, and it's infinitely patient, infinitely helpful. It's always ready to, it'll say the same thing to you dozens of times, and until you finally get it.
Well, if we make approach to the psyche the most, if we put that on the top of the list, that means we can fold active imagination and transcendent function together.
Yeah.
So that's good. All right, that's it. So it's the approach to the psyche, and then it's the objective psyche.
Mm-hmm.
So we've gone from a list of 5 down to 2. Is that?
Yeah, I guess, because they say it's sort of like they're all connected. And I would say culturally, probably collective unconscious and synchronicity, I would have to say kind of neck and neck, because a lot of people I think people would say, synchronicity, and not quite know exactly what it's the word to use instead of coincidence.
Yes.
Kind of now. Yeah. So they'll say that, and they might have 15th hand idea of what it means. Collective unconscious is less immediately something we run into in everyday life. Although Jung would say it's pushing us around all the time, but in terms of something actually happening,
it doesn't come up at too many business meetings.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So like, a synchronicity would come up or something like. Let's go with that.
In my head, that's literally memories of meetings where words like synchronicity have come up, and they have been used. Wrong is unfair, but they have gotten 15-hand descriptions. Coincidence is like a bad word now. It's like a Scooby-Doo ending where it turns out the ghost is a gardener. Like coincidence is a word that you use if you're one of those horrible over-explaining types. Like that is mere coincidence. But the polite way of saying it now is synchronicity, even if people don't know what it means.
Right. Yeah. There you go.
All right. No, that's good. All right. So approach to the psyche and then objective psyche. So we went from my confusing list of 5 or 6 down to 2, but I think we nailed it. I think you're right. I think his approach was really revolutionary.
Well, he's one of the first ones in the psychotherapeutic world to it wasn't just a place where you put a lot of stuff. I mean, Freudian theory, you can actually empty out the unconscious at some point. If you go through everything, you haul all that stuff that's in there out, bring it out to light of day, you become aware of it, and then it's empty. You've got an empty room. You have an empty basement. Whereas Jung, it's like you're trying to empty the ocean. It's not a basement. We have little puddles of consciousness metaphorically in our heads, but they are in some way connected through streams and eddies and tributaries to. I just said earlier I didn't like that image. I'm going to use it now to some larger kind of infinite ocean of things, and the way in is the way to these other worlds. I mean, these other dimensions. Where else could they possibly exist? These other dimensions or spiritual realms that we talk about in the esoteric world. Where else could they possibly exist but deeper within in some way? I mean, they're not out there anymore. This is again, that's another thing. It's only relatively a few hundred years where we stop thinking like, oh, it's out there somewhere, far away out there. It's like, no, it's far away in here in some strange way. And I mean, I think in many ways, I mean, it may not be, how should we say it may not be specifically out of any particular book of Jung's or writing, but just the general sense, I think he is the one that turned us around and said, look inside, look inside you. And for the answers to the questions you seek and that kind of thing. It sounds like some Eastern guru, but I mean that's basically what he was doing. And many people, at least from my generation, and maybe the people 10 years younger than me, 10 years older than me, they started that interior journey with a copy of Jung. Man and the Symbols, or Modern Man in Search of a Soul.
Good.
The actor Leslie Howard in the film The Petrified Forest with Humphrey Bogart and Bette Davis. If you know the film, there's a line where he says he has a copy of Modern Man in Search of a Soul when he's walking around in the desert there. So,
oh, cool.
Yeah,
good.